Welcome to Data as a Team Sport. This is School of Data's series of online conversations, videos, and podcasts where we are exploring the ever-evolving data literacy ecosystem. For those of you joining us in the Hangout, firstly, we want to say thank you for coming. Here's some guidelines that will help you in participating. First of all, we need to ask that you stay on mute. Apologies for this. We'd love to hear everyone's voice in the conversation, but this is often a less than perfect platform for doing so. So instead, we'd like to invite you to participate by using the text-based chat room for communication. You can start this by clicking the icon in the upper left-hand corner, and in the text message box that appears on the right-hand side of the screen, please type hello and introduce yourself. And just have to say, Costa, good job for already doing that. Kristen, if you want to say hello, but you've already done the prerequisite hello via your microphone, which was very lovely. If you do have questions during the Hangout, please type it in the text message box, and I'm going to pause a little later to make sure to get to them and answer them. As well, feel free to share any comments you may have there as well. Just a reminder that this is currently being broadcasted live on YouTube. A recording will also be made available on YouTube after we are finished. We are using the audio for our podcast series, and we'll also publish notes and URLs for everything that gets referenced on the School of Data blog at schoolofdata.org. So let me introduce myself. I'm Dirk Schlater from FabWriters, and along with being an active member of the School of Data community, we also provide workshops, skills building, and consultation for advocates and activists on how to build inclusive data-driven tactics to make social change strategies more effective. In this episode of Data as a Team Sport, we are joined by Friedhelm Weinberg, the Executive Director of Huridocs, an NGO that supports organizations and individuals to gather, analyze, and harness data to promote and protect human rights. Welcome, Friedhelm. Hello, sir.
Hi, Dirk, and thank you and the School of Data for having us. It's a great honor to be here.
Great, and thank you. I think a great place for us to start, one of the things that Huridocs is known for is its tools for human rights defenders to collect information and manage knowledge and documents. Just wondering if you can give us a brief overview of how these tools have evolved over the organization's 35-year history.
Absolutely. I think if we look back into almost 30 years of developing tools, then we can see a clear trajectory of not just adapting to new operating systems. So the first database that we built, FSys, was built for Word, not for Word, for DOS. And then later on, there was something called WinFSys, which, as the name would suggest, was working on Windows. And then later on, OpenFSys, which is a browser-based system. So obviously, it's staying current with the technology, but it's also adapting to make it a lot more easy to use so that you don't have to be an expert. That makes it more flexible to use so that you don't have to use a certain way of working just because the tool is built in a certain way. Tools now allow to be a lot more flexible and wider varieties of work, which also corresponds to how the human rights movement has arguably flexibilized and diversified its working. It's a bigger movement now, so there's a lot more ways of working that exist, so that schools need to respond to that. They need to live up to this. But fundamentally, I think what maybe remains the same across this trajectory is really understanding what is needed for human rights goals. Is it advocacy? Is it litigation? And making sure that the tools really support these processes. So maybe that's the mainstay. But then technologies have evolved. They're better now. There's more collaboration. There's easier use, and there's arguably stronger capabilities for analysis of larger scale information.
So, I mean, one of the things we know you're saying there that, like, the first system is developed for DOS, and that clearly our operating systems have evolved. So there's been a lot of change in terms of the technology. But have you guys noted that there's been any sort of evolution with people in understanding technology and interacting with the tools.
No, absolutely there is. I think back then it was a lot more specialized. There are a lot less people doing this. And their background often was library science. There was a lot of librarians who got into the organization of information, which makes sense. And nowadays, I think we see a lot more diverse profiles. There are software developers as a profession, and there are many of them who want to get into the human rights movement and contribute their skills. But there's also activists who are a lot more technology savvy than they might have been in the past, because it's more accessible to do so. You can be self-taught and get into this. And there's all kinds of cross-cutting profiles that come in. There are designers, because interface design is we can see much nicer interfaces, and there's a lot more possible. Also, we can touch our screens now, so it needs different skill sets, but also there is maybe more people who bring these skill sets into the development and use of these tools.
I know that Huridocs doesn't just think of itself as a tool developer. That you guys also you think of yourselves also as being capacity builders, and I'm just wondering if one sort of dominates over the others, or if there is sort of a healthy balance between the two.
If anything, I think the capacity building needs to come first, because that's when you concretely work with organizations to understand the nature of the problem that they're trying to address. How is information helpful in leading change? What kind of information you need to gather? How can you gather it? What tools are available? What is the capacity, and what support can strengthen that, so you can really have a difference? And that's, I think, fundamentally the process where a lot of the value for human rights organizations is developed. So if anything, that is the most important, because you can see concrete results. At the same time, this is giving an insight into those needs, and helps us learn and abstract what are recurring needs. Because if we only build capacity, and only it's something important, then we have the risk of reinventing the wheel over and over again. So taking the learnings, taking all the great insights from these interventions helps us build tools that correspond to those needs, and at the same time avoid investing and reinventing the wheel over and over again. So it's finding that balance. But if we would have to make a choice, I think the direct support work with human rights organizations is the most important part.
So, and one of the things that, like, for me, I consider myself a capacity builder, and I have this definition in my head of capacity building, which is capacity meaning deepening the ability of activists and advocates to understand, right, the implications of stuff. So it's more about their ability. It's improving their capacity to pick up these things and being able to apply them in their work, so that it will move their work forward. And I'm curious a little bit more, like, how do you see the tools actually supporting the capacity building? Do you think people are learning? It's that chicken and egg thing. Like, do people learn more about the human rights work from the tools themselves? Does that, do they inform each other?
It's a tricky balance. If you have a tool that suggests a certain way of working, that can be tremendously helpful, because you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to reimagine your process from the very beginning, and what you need to record, what you need to put together. At the same time, obviously, it's also guiding you in a certain direction. That's why I think before using a tool, a discovery of needs, of possibilities, and also of the real capacities going forward and the strategies needs to happen, because otherwise there's this strong risk of guiding with a tool that sends you the wrong way. So that's the risk of tools. They can send you the wrong way. At the same time, they can anchor you, and they can give you ideas. They can give you inspiration of how you could do things, and how others are already doing things, established ways of doing work that are tremendously helpful to build on. So they can provide this element of capacity building, of pre-structuring discussions that need to be anchored in a good understanding that that's the kind of pre-structuring that you want, but they can really help you basically come to something that supports your work faster, and don't spend your time on imagining something that maybe is interesting to imagine, but not the most important part. So you can then spend more time on your advocacy strategy, on actually getting the data, on managing it. So I think it's that part that is very helpful. It can be a tool for showing you something, and when you see something, it becomes real and it gives you new ideas.
Well, I think one of the things too, like, because also as a capacity builder and somebody, you know, that works with multiple groups, one of the things that I think is really critical is that you're able to take lessons and stories from one group and sort of translate them to another. And I kind of like the little bit that I've seen of the Huridocs tools. It feels to me like, in a way, the tools do that, right? Like, you have developed these tools as a result of working much more deeply with organizations, and then the tools really reflect that. And I think one of the things that's probably good to touch on specifically for the series is, you know, often folks that are doing data collection around human rights violations can be amassing a huge amount of information. And I've often, like, I remember sitting down the first time I sat down with OpenEFSIS and was being showed it, and it was about, you know, relatively simplifying the amount of information that was going to be used, right, or being collected in the thing. It was the perpetrator, the victim, and then the act of violence. And it's interesting in terms of, like, you know, thinking about what is the information you actually need, and in order to aggregate, right, and then also prove stuff, right. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me in terms of, you know, OpenEFSIS and the kind of data that was being asked to be collected in it was around being able to prove stuff in courts of law, right? And you know, with sort of international bodies and all that. And so these very specific pieces of information were really critical. And so then, you know, going out and working with an organization to help them better understand what it takes to do human rights documentation, looking at all the the information that they had collected, and then getting them to think a little bit more clearly about, like, you know, you don't need all that, you just need this. Though the other bits that they had, which was actually quite around narrative and story around violence that had happened, can be used in other contexts, specifically around, like, you know, trying to actually connect with people themselves and trying to get them to better understand, you know, the implications and the results of the violence and what was happening.
Yes, I see what you mean. I think it's important to understand, that's the point I was trying to make earlier, what it is that you want to achieve with your data, with the information you're gathering, and to have then the techniques and the tools that support you in achieving that. And in that sense, the tool can guide you, but it can also guide you in the wrong direction, especially if it comes with, as OpenEFSIS does, with a predefined methodology, which is very useful in many cases. We saw the Global Witness report that came out last week on the killing of environmental defenders. And for them, it's tremendously useful to document things in this way, because it helps them aggregate this information, do this in a very robust way. At the same time, it's not for everyone, and probably not for the group that you worked with, if the goals are different. And then it becomes not always easy to reduce, if that makes any sense. So if you have too much, more than you need, then to be able to take things away and cut things down is very difficult. So that's why I think moving forward, it was a big lesson for us to learn. How can we make sure that we don't sort of guide people too far, because once you're far, it's hard to say like I don't need that, because there's always a way you can imagine where you actually would need it, but it can be distracting you from where you actually want to get. If you actually want to get stories and narratives, then designing forms and thinking about thesaurus in these forms is probably not the most important thing you can do. So how can we design tools that support the work that you actually want to do, at the same time can give you this guidance when you need it? And that's an ongoing quest, an ongoing discovery, but I think it's a really important learning moment to see both, sides. But I think it's really going beyond tools. It's fundamental of capacity building, because I think examples can inspire you as much as they can set you off the wrong path. That's why it's really important to carefully choose what you sort of look into more deeply, or be critical when you do so.
So curious in terms of, because I haven't seen that much. I haven't gotten a chance to really dig more deeply into Uwazi, which is what you guys have sort of evolved to from the OpenEv systems. I'm just wondering, what can you speak a little bit about that and how it's different, and what's the problems it's trying to solve for human rights defenders?
Sure. The starting point is different because it's starting with the assumption that you have a lot of documents right now, later on hopefully other types of media, but you're starting with documents, you want to do something with them. So you want to understand what's in your documents, you want to extract the knowledge from your documents and build from the ground up. That can be a collection of case law, so that you make it accessible, you basically make it a research base that helps you build your next case. So you can build on doing research once, and not having to do it over again, but really building something that lives. But it also helps you if we think of more investigative types of work. If you start with, say, 60 testimonies, and you can really annotate the documents and then start identifying, well, who's who? Is this the perpetrator? Is this the victim? Then you can start stitching things together. So it's maybe a more bottom-up approach, but rooted in documents, which was a big need that we saw with human rights organizations. There was no tool that allowed you to effectively work with documents in a collaborative way that helps you extract the knowledge and get further. At the same time, many of the fundamentals of documentation apply to this. So moving forward, what we'd like to do is not just support document-driven work there, but to see this as one flavor, so to say. At the same time, coming up with, you could call them templates of work. If we think of human rights documentation, there are some more victim-centered approaches and some more perpetrator-centered approaches that require you to have different workflows. And coming up with, I wouldn't say basic, but templates that help you get jump-started in that process if you can self-identify with these. So you don't have to go all the way to the event standard methodology if you don't have to, which is the methodology that was one of the big legacies of the Huridocs of the 80s and 90s, which is a very robust methodology, but for many it's going too far. So what are the other standard methodologies, you could say, that then you can remix and build on so that you don't have to start over? So you're not driven in the wrong direction, but you can build on existing knowledge. And you also can work in comparable ways, so that if at one point you want to exchange information with someone else, this process is facilitated because you work in similar ways.
So curious too, I wanted to get you a little bit more towards how the implications of new technologies are changing your work. One of the things that I think everyone has noted is the ability for there to be documentation in a wide variety of formats these days. So mobile phones are everywhere, and they can be data collection devices, but even more robustly in terms of being able to take a video and capture stuff that is what has happened. So I'm just curious about how that has impacted your work and what you're thinking about in terms of new tools and Uwazi and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's not just us. I think it's the whole ecosystem. If we look at what the Guardian project is doing with Camera V or Verified Pixel, which is helping to support that the evidence or the media that is collected with phones would hold up in court. I think that there's important work around that. And then the question is, where does all of that go? Does it go online in a public space, which it doesn't always can, because it's sensitive information oftentimes. So I think one of the big moments that as a community we need to work on, and I think we would want to play an important role there, is ways of how to gather all this information and actually do something with it. Because right now all of this is done often in a very ad hoc way, which makes it tremendously difficult then to get into methodologies. It takes a long time to find out how to do this effectively, how to avoid duplications, and how to then retrieve later on the information you need, because a spreadsheet doesn't always allow you to do this easily. So you need to have better tools that allow you to work with this diverse media, but then annotate and build cases if you want to build cases, or generate the kind of information that you would want to display in a campaign, or be able to retrieve a certain piece of information so that then you can investigate further, because it is a lead. It turns out that you need to go into more deeply. So I think this, one could say, that there is more media means we need to have better media management and better information management that takes stock of that, and that allows us to use it in our investigations. But then the investigation techniques, they will surely change, but I think they'll be rooted in many of the things that are established, and that are rightly established professional standards.
Yeah, and often, you know, like you're saying, like it is about, you know, who you are trying to prove things to, and as a result of that, the rigor of the documentation, you know, changes. So, you know, I mean, video is great, can be great for the general public and getting an idea of what's happening, and also being, you know, being able to do that exposure. But, you know, it still can be taken out of context. It still can be misconstrued and all that sort of stuff. And I'm also, I think within that, just curious in terms of, you know, one of the things that we're trying to explore very deeply in this series is how have things like fake news and that sort of stuff impacted folks' work. And so just wondering if there's been any impact for you guys in terms of both this idea of fake news, but also like data-driven confusion and all that. Is that anything that is changing Huridocs' world in any way?
I think it's a very important conversation starter, because it is very important to be rigorous and thorough in the work you're doing, and not to cut corners on the reliability of the information that you're working on and the statements you're making. So it's simply not acceptable to lie with data, even though it can be tempting to mislead for good purposes, for good goals. So this whole discourse of fake news and how easy it also put on to legitimate actors really helps carry the point home of the importance of not doing anything that's in any way dubious or not based on fact and rigorous methodologies. So it's really important way to carry that point home. But it's also a clear call to action that just having the facts straight is not enough. You need to be able to explain them, you need to engage, and you also need to defend them. So while it's the foundation that we work on, that's we need to have the facts straight, it is, I think, an important call to understand, well, but how do we explain those stories so that it's not going to be drowned in fake news? How do we make sure that that's the story that's heard, and that's the message that makes the breakthrough? So to link a fact-based approach with strategies that help us engage and win over arguments. So I think that's the important part for our work, but I think for civil society in general.
Well, yeah, because I think one of the things that, you know, into like people overall, and actually one of the things that has been a consistent theme in the series and what we've been hearing is that, like, it is so very critically important that people understand how to use data to tell stories. And often what happens, if you do have a large set of data and all you're doing is conveying numbers, right, and all that it is actually much easier to be dismissive for people. Like they can't connect well. Whereas you have that individual story or something like that, people are much more likely to connect to that. And in that also, because people are doing that bit in using data to obscure and hide stuff, that we have this real struggle with maintaining that ability to have that really strong narrative along with the data that is then backing it up and sort of proving that this is happening. And I think the bit is, making those connections, right? It's much harder for people to do, but we have to be much more rigorous in the way that we do it, both in terms of, saying this is the evidence and this is really what's going on, but then also having those really good stories that people will then connect to, and then hopefully, the bigger data points they'll see those and be able to say, oh yes, this is, this data does back up what I know to be true. And just, I think the other thing too, in terms of civil society organizations, it does often come down to trust, like who is the messenger, right? And so that point that you initially made in terms of, well, we have to make sure that we are, presenting facts and evidence that of what is really going on. We have to be extra sure that we are doing that, because the second we get away from that, people will stop trusting us, right? And we have to make sure that we maintain that trust.
Absolutely, I think that's the critical point. Trust is easy to lose, and it's hard to gain. But also having the facts right, it's proven to be very efficient in actually winning over arguments, especially if we look at the international area, where if you go to the UN and you go to, say, the Human Rights Committee, if you can bring documented facts, then it is very hard for a government to refute that, because then they have to prove you wrong. So It can be extremely powerful, but that's only one part of the engagement. So if we just rely on facts and numbers, then we're probably missing our critical parts.
Right, and but it is also the bit of you get the courts and being able to prove it in courts, but then that doubly thing in terms of the hearts and minds. One thing I wanted to make sure though that I got you to talk a little bit more, and I don't want to get too far from it since we were on this sort of tech end, but in terms of getting human rights defenders to understand the implications of new technologies that are coming down the pike. I know you guys are doing some work on machine learning and all that, and trying to actually use that to help with documentations. But just curious in terms of in the capacity building side, how are you making those connections, and how is that what is that making the future of Huridocs look like?
Yeah, I think there are some technologies that are coming up that bring great potentials for human rights organizations that are right now also very much connotated with fear of the negative impacts that they could be having, rightly so. So if we think of artificial intelligence and machine learning, it can be extremely scary. At the same time, if we like it or not, they're coming. And they can also become very powerful tools in our ability to process information, first of all, and to learn about connections that we might not be able to make ourselves. So if we take machine learning, one of the experiments that we have done was processing large amounts of case law to identify specific cases. So the specific example is we've been taking case law from Pacific Island countries, and we're trying to identify with machine learning techniques which of these are about sexual and gender-based violence, and specifically against women. And doing that kind of work and then verifying it, obviously, with humans for sampling, has shown us it is actually possible to identify these cases out of a much larger set of information, and then identify things within these cases that you can build on for your advocacy work. So you can then see that there is bias in sentencing. There is a set of arguments that's always held to let abusers get away more easily. So if they excuse, for example, or if they pursue traditional ways of reconciliation, they don't get the appropriate sentence. So that's been showing us that these techniques can also be extremely helpful in uncovering these biases and showing something that people might know or have a fuzzy feeling about. But when presented with that on such a large scale, and we hope that can make a difference. And on a very pragmatic level, like this is something that can help small organizations operate on a much larger scale in their information processing capacity and in their analysis capacity. And that should free them up to use that knowledge, that insight gained for advocacy. So done right, and that's a big if at this point, as a lot of that innovation comes from big companies, this can be a big moment in democratizing access to big analysis. So that's something that could be very exciting and that we want to explore further and to make accessible in simple ways so that there are these small groups who can have these capacities that they wouldn't have otherwise, because you would have to spend years of people power to process documents, where a machine can do this quite fast. Not always accurate to the extent that we want right now, but it's getting much better, and it's getting to a point where it becomes seriously interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's interesting to me as we've sort of shifted in terms of the evolution of IT and technology. It's so much information is so accessible. And where we often get bogged down is our own abilities to process, manage and go through all this information. So, the machine learning bit seems like the logical next step. But one of the things that discussions I've been having recently that have shed a lot of learning for myself is understanding like the differences between the terms machine learning and also artificial intelligence, and that they are very much two different things. And machine learning is much more around creating algorithms and things like that people can use to do these things, where you are saying, here are the specific things that that you're telling the machine, these are the specific things that mean this. Right, and the difference between that and artificial intelligence is not us telling the machine that that's what that means, and the machine or the computer coming up with it itself. And so within that, what I think this bit that in terms of the machine learning that I think people really need to grab onto and understand is that that if humans are giving the information to create these algorithms, those algorithms are going to have the same biases that people do. And that's a pro and a con, right? Like the pro is, we can pick out these things. The con is that, sometimes it perpetuates discrimination and all that other stuff that humans have. So anyways, just wondering like how much you're trying to grapple with that kind of tension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a lot of discussions about that exactly from the angle that you're talking about, because it's the question is not is it creating any new biases, but is it just displaying existing biases, and then if you take it a step further and build decision making on it, then obviously you have the same bias but on a much larger scale. So there's a risk in that. There's a big risk. At the same time, we should really look and zoom into the capabilities to learn about these biases and see what that means for us as humans. Maybe we're okay with them. Maybe we're not. And there are probably some that we're okay with and some we're not okay with. So it's allowing us to have these discussions and deliberations. I think it's just important to not jump from having these discoveries to saying, well, okay, that's how things are going to be from now on a much larger scale. That's the big risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing too. Like it's constantly changing and it's shifting so rapidly, and you know what I mean. Like we're just starting to understand the implications of machine learning, and the implications it has on our work and all that. But like we're in this phase now where the technology is evolving so quickly, and people are saying AI is just around the corner. We're not there yet, right? And that's going to have a whole other level of implications of what's coming down. And I think for those of us that have been working for a while now and have seen these evolutions in terms of technologies, like in terms of the capacity building element of the work, like we really do have to help the organizations we work with be prepared and be able to understand, right, that these things might be providing easy answers now, but in the long run it might turn out to be problematic, and there might be something that comes along relatively quickly that's going to make it all obsolete.
Yeah, I think it's important to embrace that complexity and chaos to an extent, and not be carried away by doomsday scenarios or by two grand master plans. One thing that's really carried that home for me, I'll share that with you for the notes, but there's a book on basically the history of the Soviet internet. And for decades, up until they shut it down in the 80s, they were pursuing a massive sort of AI to run the state planning, to create live state planning rather than 5-year plans for a planning economy. And it was as ridiculous as a planning economy is in the first place, because it's just creating a monster for all eventualities that was never going to work out. But they were extremely excited about that. They invested tremendous brain power into building this big system. And what's really survived from that are the small discoveries and the small learnings that then have made it into mainstream. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with technology. Some things might be scarier than we think, and many of the things might not be as scary. But if we embrace them and build them into our tactics and use them, then I think we have tremendous potential for social change that we can lead with that. We just have to be forward-looking in that sense. We shouldn't underestimate the challenge, but I strongly believe we need to be forward-looking and embracing those.
Well, I think it's the thing too, in terms of the what the capacity building work is really around, making sure that people are practicing good critical thought when they are using these tools. And having the sort of awareness of all those implications and all that. I just want to give Kaustub a heads up. Kaustub, I have one more question I'm going to ask Friedhelm, and I want to honor the fact that you are sticking with us and listening to this conversation. If you want to test your mic in just a minute after I'm done with this, that would be great. But more importantly, what I'd like to invite you to do is ask a question or two, and want to give you the privilege of doing that since you've been here for so long and all that. So in just a minute we'll do that. But let me just ask Friedhelm now this final question. So this series is about exploring different elements of what we are calling the data literacy ecosystem, and we, and basically the title of the series, like Data is a Team Sport, is to get people to understand that when an organization or anyone working on social change work is going to interact with data, going to use data in the social change work, it's going to be not just them. They're going to have to be working with other people with various points of expertise in order for them to use it successfully. So curious in terms of, you know, what you guys see in the work that you're doing, both around the capacity building work and also the tool development. You know, where do you see the big gaps in the ecosystem that you guys are working in?
I think one of the big challenges is, for many organizations, you gather lots of information if you want it or not, right? You get tremendous insights, and then you do something with that. It can be writing reports. Very often it's writing reports, or it's writing briefing papers, or it's just for your own thinking, and then you'll be trying to design a strategy. So there's a lot of information coming in, there's a lot of data coming in, and there are things that are coming out. And linking this with a structure and a strategy that helps you do things in a more reliable way and a more structured and streamlined way, where you don't have to spend too much time on mundane things that you need to do over and over again, that you have to figure out every single time you're doing something. At the same time, allowing you to learn new things, and having the flexibility to help you adopt your strategies. So that critical part is sort of moving from raw data and outputs and bridging that with having the right data models for information you're collecting, the right tools, and the processes accompanying that. And what's been really difficult is really this process of moving from raw to something structured in terms of information management. And I believe as an ecosystem, we're not doing enough to support that kind of work. Despite it not being rocket science, it's not that difficult. And we're too often making it either something that's either too complicated or something where you stay in the messy rawness of things. I believe that's something where through case studies, for maybe educational materials, we could do a better job.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. Why do you think that is, though? Do you think is because sort of the market forces aren't really there? Like nobody's really identified that as a place to sort of make money and develop stuff around that, or do you think there's something else?
No, I think it's more a translation gap than anything. I mean, there's good resources out there for doing this, and there's expertise around that, but those who work with data in the first place and where it appears and those who use it are not usually exposed to that kind of expertise, or not coming from these backgrounds, and that's why it seems as something more obscure than it is.
Cool. Kaustub, you have any questions? And you've come off mute. Is it working? Okay, we're not hearing anything, but if you do have a question, you want to type it in the chat box. Or at least let us know whether or not, if you don't have any questions, let us know in the chat room. Okay, thank you very much for that, Kaustub, and for me putting you on, allowing me to put you on the spot. But and again, thank you for being here. Actually, one thing we discussed before, Friedhelm, that I really wanted to make sure that I got out, and in the line of this conversation, I realized that I hadn't. Your organization has recently, or in its recent history, I should say, you've now brought developers in-house, and I'm wanted to get you to tell us a little bit about that experience, about bringing tool developers in-house and working side by side with the capacity builders that you have, and how that has been, and what is there anything that sort of surprised you around doing that, or any lessons learned from going through that experience?
I think it's a surprisingly good experience. So let's start with that.
Good.
I think it makes a real difference if you're part of one team. But that being said, I mean, there's some real translation needs, right? If you're a software developer, and you haven't been in your private life been an activist necessarily, you always have been in favor of social justice, human rights, but you maybe have not been part of a human rights organization. That is a culturally different experience, because there are serious differences to the commercial world. There's higher risk, there's higher data protection needs, there's a different scale. Most human rights organizations are a lot smaller. So it's a big learning experience to understand that and to understand what's tickling, what's driving human rights defenders, because I think it's an important thing to picture in your work and to know with whom you're working and what for. So that's, I think, been a big experience of how can we support software developers who come in-house, who become part of our organizations, to have that same understanding and be immersed in this world that we deeply care about, that we're a part of, and vice versa. There's software development speak and software development methodologies that are really good and really helpful, and understanding these and embracing these and how we can better actually manage our work and drive things forward, and understand how we can be responsive and deliver technology in a responsive and fast way. That's also been a real learning moment to NGO people who are thinking in terms of projects and project plans that are linked to proposals and reporting. That is always a very planning heavy and less driven in something where you rapidly build and analyze and look how you can change and evolve. So it's been a real learning experience sort of from both sides, but it's been a really good experience as well, because having that common understanding, or building that common understanding, I'm not sure if we have it yet, is, I think, unlocking a lot of creativity for our joint mission, which is supporting the human rights movement to make the best of information and technology. So ideally, the parts become a bigger whole. And I feel we're having a real good experience in that regard, at least so far.
Cool. I mean, one of the ways it's been connecting with me lately is around human-centered design and user-centered design and these things, agile methodologies and Scrum methodologies. It's been an interesting moment in sort of the tech social change intersection where these methodologies are starting to return and inform the sort of activist advocacy, community organizing end of it. And this piece of, that software developers, these methods that they use in terms of getting user input early, right, and often, and doing a lot of prototyping and iteration of tools and stuff before they are released. Turns out that kind of methodology is actually a great way for campaigners to get people involved in terms of the development of both the strategies around their campaigns, but then also developing tactics that can, as prototypes, and getting people to give them lots of inputs about where they move forward. And it's a way of doing this sort of broader sharing of ownership. And one of the things that it has been pointed out to me several times recently is actually good old-fashioned community organizing informed software developers and tech developers, and they integrated those methodologies. And while this has been happening, a lot of campaigners have been, and social change folks have been feeling overwhelmed and pushed to doing shortcuts, right? And also, doing that bit of like developing campaign strategies in-house, or just moving forward without them, without a campaign strategy. And it's it's interesting, like now it's starting to come back to them. Oh, hey, this is a great way to really be engaging people and getting a large group of people engaged in what you are trying to do. And so it's just kind of ironic that these methodologies that started out here are coming back and as we say, it's old wine in a new bottle, but because you can then say to people, hey, these are methodologies that are driving technologies and making new technologies even better, you know what I mean? All of a sudden they get attention, and people are much more open to them by putting it in that way, instead of saying, this is old school stuff. You know what I mean? Like, this is the way we did it, you know, hundreds of years ago, or not hundreds, but, you know, decades ago, and all that, and for the civil rights movement and all that stuff. So anyways, interesting bit to take in. We are, oh my God, I have just rambled on, and it is 5 minutes to the hour. So two things I want to ask you. First one, is there anything that you want to plug, anything that you want to make sure in terms of Huridocs and your work that people know about, and we can, you know, help to publicize both in the podcast, but also in the blog post, in terms of directing people to URLs and resources and things like that?
You're being very nice for offering that. Thank you. There's two things actually that I'd encourage people to have a look at. The first is the Huridocs Collaboratory, which is a space for practitioners to exchange on human rights information and specifically documentation. So it's a place where you can go bring your questions, but also where discussions, not quite dissimilar to the one we're having here, are being held, but really focused on using information in different human rights scenarios. So some of the upcoming discussions will, for example, be on documenting human rights violations in coalitions, and previous ones have included digitizing documents. So it's really around that nexus, and it's a place where people come together, bring their questions, and also bring their answers with diverse expertise. The second is WASI, which is something we've already talked about, where in October we'll have a stable release of a very exciting new piece of software that will support human rights organizations to really make the best of documents in terms of learning, but also sharing what's in there.
Cool, great. And so the other thing I'd love to get from you is there things out there now that are inspiring and helping to inform your work? Anything in terms of readings or you know, resources, things like that you are drawing upon to help move you forward?
Yes, absolutely. On an organizational level, there's a book that I think I'm taking a lot of inspiration from, because it's explaining a different way of how we can be creative in organizations, be respectful with each other, without making everything a big circle in which voices are drowned, or a hierarchical top-down decision-making monster. And that book is called Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux. Another book that is speaking to the aspect of how do I structure my database and how do I choose the right labels, which I think is fantastic, is Information Architecture in the O'Reilly series. It's really accessible and has helped many of my colleagues and I to really get to grip with some seemingly complicated but actually not very complicated concepts on how to make the best of data. And then I was referencing it earlier. One book that I found very interesting is How to Not Network a Nation: The Uneasy History of the Soviet Internet by Benjamin Peters, which is a really fantastic deep dive into some really interesting work around machine learning and networking, starting in the 1960s all the way to the 80s, in the service of a grand world vision that, as we all know, collapsed. So it's a good reminder of extreme intelligence, extreme excitement, high-level work not going anywhere. So there's a lot of interesting lessons in there to reflect on.
Great. Those are great. Anything else?
No, that's plenty already, I think.
Well, cool. Well, thank you for those. So this concludes this online conversation for Data as a Team Sport, and it's been great to do this deep dive into Huridocs. Big thank you, Friedhelm, for your time and all the effort and bearing with my questions and various tangents today. Got to give a big thanks to Caitlin Rogers and the School of Data team for making this happen. Please stay tuned to the School of Data website for more information on the next Data is a Team Sport conversation. You can find the notes from these conversations along with the links to the video recordings of the Hangouts on the School of Data website at schoolofdata.org. Have I mentioned the podcast series? You can find it on the School of Data website, but we are publishing direct to SoundCloud, and you can find us on the iTunes Store and Stitcher. Just search for Data is a Team Sport. Our latest episode features Heather Leesons from the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, and she is talking about how to advance data literacy in humanitarian organizations. So we'd like to end this with a big thank you to our participants, viewers, and listeners. We hope this has benefited and informed your own data literacy efforts.